to the new podcast exploring and cataloguing queer life. I'm your host, Cassidy Marler on the Lilac Archive, a dedicated audio space where queer individuals and organisations can show their work and contribution to queer culture in an evolving and collaborative format. Each episode will be joined by a guest, going through their interests, projects and passions, highlighting everyone from all aspects of queer identities. This is your first time listening. Grab a herbal tea or coffee, get comfy, and I hope you enjoy. Today we are joined by Ollie Kemp, currently in her final year of studying film and TV down at Falmouth, Cornwall. She's a writer, sound producer, and avid viewer of strange and sometimes forgotten films and TV. She's here to discuss her own process of writing, as well as how we can instill queerness into our on-screen narratives. Ollie, welcome to the archive. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very good. I'm in a very good mood. I'm happy to be on the cleanest podcast this side of the century.
Thank you. So obviously today we're going to get a lot into your writing work, maybe touch a bit in your sounds, although I know that that's not necessarily the biggest thing that you do, and I know that we both share a love of Star Trek.
We do. I do love Star Trek, especially Deep Space Nine.
Indeed, Deep Space Nine, the best Star Trek. This has been said beforehand, but the best one, and in my opinion, and that's the official opinion of the podcast.
That's the official opinion of the podcast and the Star Trek fandom as a whole.
Just in general, it is the best one by far. Okay, so our first question is, what got you interested in writing and sound specifically?
Well, I'll talk a little bit sound first, because I think that one has been a much more recent attachment for me, because I've always had a long interest in writing. With sound specifically, I've always been fascinated by creature sounds and effects in video games and movies. I really just love any sort of the way people construct those sounds, usually just basic instruments, taking animal sound effects and kind of mashing them together to create something. I think it always has helped to flesh out a film or TV show for me when I hear the sort of creative uses of these sounds. It's better than a typical monster I've always loved the sort of more the clicking of an insect.
So it's about creating the atmosphere, giving life to the character you're seeing on screen as a creature, instead of just the visuals of, oh my god, this is a scary creature. It's more about filling in those details and elements that really make it feel alive.
Because a great creature design is something to respect, especially a practical one. I've always loved practical effects, The Thing. Smile recently was a really great one with the sort of monster. Put that up on screen in the audio podcast.
Yeah, just big smile.
Just convert it to sound waves. But I think the way something can hold up on screen is by its sound. I think if you strip away the visuals of something completely and include only audio, and you just have this sort of creature sound, if you've done a really good job at sort of creating that, you can immediately build an image of that creature. And without that sound element or sort of that care for it, you do just kind of lose that, and you might just be thinking, oh, I'm not watching a monster, I'm watching kind of this rubbery thing that's lunging at people.
I guess that's a lot of the work of working in film and TV, of getting this rubbery thing to be the monster that we see on screen, rather than just prosthetic. It is actually filling in that gap.
You think, because we recently watched Tremors.
Yes, we did. That was a really good film.
It was a very good film. It was a very fun film, and the monsters in that movie, they are very well made. They're great puppets. But the sound that the graboid makes, which is the name of the creature.
It's such a bizarre name, but I think it works really well.
It's just this the sort of sound is so perfect and so specific, and it's not overused. It's not for something big. It's just this is what this would sound like. I guess the logic of that creature sound effects cements it in the film's world, or our world, properly. So
it's about the filling in the sort of blanks that you wouldn't see, which I guess is similar-ish in writing.
Yeah.
When you're creating, the obvious process of world building, but you're creating all these little elements that someone might not see. The character, just the background, how those elements come through in the nuances and the way you write them.
Oh, absolutely. Your job as a writer, which is a very, very important one, is to cement the world. I'm going to talk specifically for TV, because that is my main interest. TV itself, you have to get people into the world immediately, episode 1. And maybe...
Absolutely.
I think...
don't know how you feel about pilots.
Pilots are always a very interesting one. People make a lot of mistakes with pilots, but that's fair enough. It's a pilot. Because obviously the pilot we see on TV will not be as well manicured as the original pitch pilot that they've probably shown to just a boardroom. Usually the problems with a lot of pilots is that people don't really have faith in the original idea, and they usually like pad it out with something to like hook people in immediately. And hooks are important. I think recently in our writing class we were discussing Stranger Things, and our lecturer was saying that because obviously the show opens, a monster grabs a scientist, pulls him up and kills him, and then it cuts to the kids playing D&D, and he was sort of pitching that in a way that, and no disrespect to him, and he was sort of saying without the monster we sort of lose the element of intrigue in the show. And I sort of partially agree. I think it depends on the show. Stranger Things could ditch that opening, because the surprise of seeing these like friends in the 80s playing D&D, hanging out, and then this monster element is introduced is what is the hook. It's the real hook. People really do struggle to find that hook for TV shows, often out of a fear that you're not grabbing the audience immediately, and sort of not having a lot of faith in audience patience.
So is that something that you do in your writing when you're looking for that hook? That sort of moment of, oh, now I've got the audience, now they're going to be interested in it.
Yes, absolutely. Like in my recent project I'm writing at the moment called Frail, premiering on
on NBC.
On NBC.
Saturday nights.
My plan with Frail was to, I'll talk more about it a little bit later, just to build up an expectation and then to shock the audience. And that sort of plays out over the beginning of the script, but I realizes I needed a little mini version of that just in the opening. So I sort of take that build up that I'm going to do for the rest of the script and I just condense it into a single scene. And then it's like, oh, you know that this is a show that will surprise you, but you don't exactly know how it will surprise you.
We just said we'll link back into some later questions I'm going to ask you. Yes. What we talk about a bit later on. When did you first get interested in writing? Was it the classic thing of like, I was in an English class and I just loved it? Or was it, I watched this really amazing TV show and I wanted to know how did they make that? And you found out, oh, the writers are a big part of this.
English class absolutely damaged my love for writing. I think our focus in English was not really on like creative practices that were very limited, because in school that's just not what it's about. I mean, I read a lot of interesting literature in school. Like I really loved In Spectacles.
Everyone mentions In Spectacles.
Yeah.
I've never read it. I have no desire to read it.
We have no desire.
No, I feel like, again, from English, all of the people in my we didn't actually do it in Spectacles, but the people who did do it in the other English classes were like, don't do it. We hate it.
They hate it.
They genuinely, because it was one of those, we did it for a final exams. So everyone was saying we absolutely hate it. It's such a horrible book to do. And I don't know if that's true, but from that experience, I don't particularly want to read it.
No, it's a really interesting, it's a socialist text. J.B. Priestley wrote it. It's really...
J.B. Priestley.
Oh, yeah. Oh, we all know J.B. Priestley. Typical. Sorry, I can't talk about In Spectacles. Anyway, I found the literature in classes quite interesting, like In Spectacles, Sign of the Four, which is a Sherlock Holmes book, which is very racist, but it's an interesting text, and Romeo and Juliet. I thought they're all interesting, but I never really found a passion for writing. When I attempted to do some of my very early creative writing in English language, it was some of the most embarrassing work I've ever done. And I'm just sort of recently looking back on it, I thought, that's terrible.
Are there any current projects you're involved in? Perhaps ones that you've taken that initial interest and continue to develop it?
Yes, I'm obviously working on my own personal project, which is a 60-page script. It's my final project. And I'm also doing just some script editing for people, just sort of looking over the scripts that I find interesting personally. But the 60 page has really been my priority. That is Frail. As I set up, it's like writing, but not really. Frail is a very important script to me. It's my final project, obviously, so I've got a lot riding on it. And it is a story where I'm explicitly exploring trans themes. I'm exploring a lot of my own personal fears of the world, and what I like to get across in my writing usually are taking my quite irrational fears and the way my mind works, my beautiful mind, and putting it in a story where it's real. Mm-hmm. So those irrational fears are now real. A lot of like horror media really pulls on that as well. It's like, what if the thing that you feared the most actually existed?
Yeah, I think you told me the concept for this. My general response is I was like horrified by the concept. I was like, this repulsed to me. Well, maybe the repulse is not the best word, but I just felt like that is such a very adverse reaction to it.
No, and that's generally my response. I mean, I want people to like it. I want people to sort of respect it as a good piece of work, but I do want it to be an upsetting text and want to provoke a reaction. I love TV shows. It's my favorite medium to engage with stories because I like films, but I always feel that like they're so contained. I just do love the ongoing story narratives in like most like long-running shows like X-Files I'm currently watching.
I also feel like that because I think I love films as a condensed event. You watch it,
definitely.
It's 2 to 3 hours, more like 3 hours now. Looking at you, Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer, yeah.
Slimer, more like.
You know, it's 3 hours and you condense all of this. With a TV show, you can pace it. One episode, 2 episodes a day. I like going through that and seeing the plot lines really evolve. Because you get more like on-screen performance, you get more minutes, you just get more time
you
to
develop a connection with it.
And you develop a connection in little bits of, funnily enough, there's a lot you can cram into like 45 minutes, an hour.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to see the little details come through.
I think episodic TV shows especially are, I think, disrespected a little bit. Like people think, oh no, a serialized TV show, that's how you get character across. But like the little smatterings of like character work in episodic like runs of shows is fantastic. Especially when it focuses on a character specifically. It feels more natural than a lot of like more serialized shows. No disrespect to like shows like Breaking Bad or anything, because that's a very, very good show. But that is a show that understands how to pace itself.
Yes. A
lot of the problem with a lot of serialized shows, and this is mostly like because of streaming models, they're about 8 episodes long.
And they're, an hour long-ish.
They barely give time for the characters, and then the show's over.
I felt a lot of shows get that, where you get into it. 2 seasons, especially when they're 2 seasons and cancelled, and you're like, oh, just getting into that. You've talked about Frail, there's a new project, which I'll allow you to expand upon. What is your process for writing and crafting stories like Frail or any other work you've done?
See, the process for me it's a little bit different for every single idea. With Frail, it was a lot of me walking around and trying to, because the Frail itself is centered around a very young character, a teenage character, and extrapolating some of my own teenage experiences onto her. And I've had to get into that headspace by just thinking back quite a lot, which is not like an overly pleasant experience. It's not like I can't do it. I mostly just had to go on a lot of long walks just to be completely alone to think about that. But then with other ideas, I sometimes just listen to like a specific song. Recently, I was in a bit of distress. I wasn't feeling great. Usually a lot of my ideas come from me not feeling great.
So you're one of those writers that create some despair?
Yeah, I'm a very deep person.
But I think there are. I'm thinking the only one that can come to mind, and this is an editing note for me if I do find any others, is Charles Bukowski. Editing me here, Charles Bukowski did write from a sense of despair. He was one of the first writers and poets to capture the depravity and downtrodden nature of a lot of American urban neighborhoods, specifically in the 1920s, through his own experiences as an immigrant to America and his particularly unpleasant childhood. There's also Emil, who wrote a sense of despair in human nature. But I think with these 2 examples, it's important to remember that writing from despair is not the only way.
Charles Bukowski.
Where he wrote some of his best stories, some of his harrowing experiences. He was homeless all the time. He was like just a vagabond, jumping from city to city. I'm not saying that you do the same thing, but do you find in those moments of despair, the little pinprick of hope?
Writing is an outlet for me because I think writing is an outlet for everyone. Building an idea purely on misery and like your own personal misery isn't going to work. You do sort of lose yourself in it. What I usually do is, one, it's a good outlet to get these ideas, sort of realize them again. Then it's not just in my head, it's on the page now. But then I also make sure to draw from my own media experience, like TV shows, movies I've watched, and supplant it into that. So now that quite real emotion becomes fantastical in a certain way, and a fantastical story about people going through something miserable is interesting, and it can be quite wonderful to watch.
I find that when I'm watching TV shows about a genuinely, quite traumatic experience or horrific, the fantasy element of it allows me to experience it as this great adventure, this big drama that's not, a lot of these situations, if they're real life, you'd be going, oh my God. But because I'm watching them on screen and I know what's going to happen to the characters is written, it's sort of the intention of the writers and there's adventure behind it. I'm like, oh, it's just what's going to happen next. The next thing for them, rather than, oh my God, what's going to happen to them?
And sometimes that's good, but like sometimes the anticipation to feel like, oh my God, what's going to happen to them is fun. It's good to feel that stress, but you always know at the end of the day, oh, it will probably work out fine. If it doesn't work out the way you expected it, maybe you'll just get really angry. And that's also fun because then you're still engaging with the story. Even if it's not necessarily like, oh, I'm not happy with how this turned out, you're still thinking about it, that shows that you've built like a nice relationship with this show.
Indeed. And you were saying about going on walks and listening to music. That is a more, I was going to say introspective element, but there is something about that in terms of listening to other media and having these little rituals almost when we create. I find them always quite relaxing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for the past couple nights, I've been listening to this movie soundtrack and writing this one specific idea I've been thinking about. And I've been doing the same couple songs every single night just before I go to bed. I write something, and genuinely it's given me a lot more peace than I've had in like a long time. I felt a lot more comfortable, like I'm not as restless as I was. I'm a lot more coherent with the ideas I want to create. Finding those rituals, and they change constantly. Maybe after a while it will stop working. Those sort of little rituals and little patterns do bring you a lot of peace. And then to create something out of that is really wonderful.
That is genuinely really nice to hear.
Just going to say about like the reality and the fantasy of a show is very important. But I think the problem with a lot of TV shows at the moment is that they lean very heavily on the fantasy to sort of mitigate the reality of it. This is the one problem with episodic TV shows majorly, is that they'll get lost in the fantasy of their own story and forget the characters that are driving it. And so my sort of vision is this, that I want to create texts that are powerful and impactful and mean something, that still have a fantastical element to them, but the fantasy is never eroding the true core message that I'm trying to like reach.
So it's that fine balance between fantasy and reality. How much of each do you want to give the audience? Do you want the audience to feel the reality, but also have the comfort of this is a TV show at the end of the day? Or you lean too much into fantasy and they forget the elements it's grounded upon?
Absolutely. I think a lot about a TV show Doctor Who. I was an author for one of the book series, writer Lawrence Miles, who I was researching when I was doing my dissertation, and he spoke about the perceived cowardice he saw in the writing of Doctor Who.
Oh my God, just calling them out. I mean, fair enough. I haven't watched a lot of Doctor Who, so I can't exactly comment on that, but I know that you have.
Yeah, I mean, this is for the revival era of the show. He was sort of mostly talking about when Doctor Who is trying to push a message to the audience, they'll often soften it to not offend the audience too much.
This is something that's happened, allegedly, with the newer iterations of Star Trek. Because when Discovery came out in 2016, everyone was going, it's too preachy, it's too on the nose, and people were saying, well, Star Trek's always been preachy and on the nose. You're just disconnected from the context. Yeah. You're watching an episode written in 87 about nuclear war. You're watching it like 2015, 16, when that's no longer the reality. When that was aired, that was very much on people's minds. And, you know, I'm not going to put my own opinions on the writing of Star Trek Discovery, but there is that element of films and TV have always been trying to push a message. The context doesn't always line up for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Deep Space Nine, it's one of those shows that does feel quite timely now, especially with some certain things going on in the world. It is drawing from a specific historical context that might not be entirely relevant today. So you might be able to watch it and, like you say, disconnect from what it's trying to say to you. But at the time, it was probably very impactful and groundbreaking.
Yeah, not to turn into another sort of Star Trek section, but I think a lot, we both know Star Trek is an easy thing for us both to call back to. So, having taken all that, do you see writing as a sacred process specifically for you, or for writers in general?
Absolutely. I think writing is the most important part of the entire creative process for no matter what. Specifically in the context of a TV show, movie, the world doesn't exist without the writing. Once you have that script, it gives so many other people the opportunity to include their own creative elements in there. The script is the core template, and I think a lot of people neglect it because it isn't flashy. Being a director, being a cinematographer, I've noticed in a lot of people who have been cinematographers for a long time a certain level of like disregard for the writing process because it's not visual. When scripts are some of the most visual elements of the entire story, they will help to define what this world is going to look like and what it can provide to other people. I think that being a director and being a cinematographer is very important, but if you don't even have a cursory knowledge of writing, you are going to fall short.
So do you feel that like in modern writing and modern TV, the emphasis is more on visual effects and being flashy that draws people in?
I mean, I could talk about like streaming services shows, like they're trying to be very flashy and big, but those are sort of a very minimal part of the stuff on TV at the moment. They're not really like defining it. I think about Stranger Things again, because it's on my mind. The new series of that was flashy in a way that it was trying to replicate iconography from previous eras of itself. Oh, Eleven's shaved her head again. The evil scientist man, the sexy scientist man is back.
He's not sexy.
He's not.
He's like, not sexy. I don't know where you got that idea from.
We're sort of going back to the feel of the first series again, or maybe the second series or whatever. But I think majority of TV shows have to rely still on their own merits because they've not got huge budgets. They can't afford to have cheap-looking, flashy effects on screen, constant self-referential moments happening. They have to rely purely on character. I'm watching a TV show at the moment. I just finished the first episode. It's called The Listeners. It's a really stupid title for a show. It is pulling on a lot of like indie films, like a little bit of horror. It's a very grounded show, but it has that minor fantastical element in there, and it is already hooked me in without any sort of background in it. Just the concept is interesting enough to like pull me in.
You talked about going on walks and listening to music as two things that you do when you write. Do you do anything else to create a sacred process for writing, or are those the two main elements you use?
So those are ones I've definitely pulled on quite a lot because a certain song can really help put you in mind of a character. With Frail, I created specific character playlists of songs that I can't listen to sometimes. Sometimes when I'm thinking of ideas, I do just have a little bit of a freak out. It'll be 2 a.m. and I'm trying to go to bed. Constant like thoughts will come into my head that I'm not necessarily happy about, and it will cause me to have to move around, and that will give me more ideas.
Interesting. I was going to say that a lot of the time, sometimes the best ideas do come to us either at the end of the day, at the beginning of the day, and just little moments. I do need like an audio medium when I'm working, which makes it when editing this podcast kind of difficult because this is the audio medium. Do need something else that's doing it like me to have going on in the background. I've never really got the concept of song lists for characters. That's something I'm really interested about.
Yeah, it's very recent for me that I've done this. It was mostly for Frail because this is the biggest project I've ever done. This isn't just sort of something casual of me just like, I've wrote down that idea, I'll leave that now. I really wanted to get into the headspace of these characters specifically. I mentioned before that the main character, her name's Ada. I put a lot of myself into her, and I put a bit of myself into the main antagonist of it, but I have to make sure that those two characters aren't just me. They have to be something else as well. So I sort of put songs together that I thought don't necessarily mimic my experience, but mimic their like headspace right now. It's been really interesting because mostly their songs have been very separate. The antagonist is quite aggressive and quite self-hating, where Ada's is very lost. But I found one song recently where it overlaps in both of them, and that has given me a new insight in how I want their dynamic to be in the script.
That's quite interesting. And how you actually use them to aid the script writing process. I guess music is a big part of that as well.
Absolutely.
And the emotional connection that we see to it. I think it is always really interesting to me to see how other people treat their sacred process of creating. And you've been talking about Frail a lot.
Oh, yeah.
From what I know, you're obviously a teenage girl, and the antagonist is an older man.
Ed, in his like 50s.
Do you instill any sense of queerness in your work, perhaps with Frail, as the hearing you mentioned, or any other works? Is there a sense where you're like, I need to instill queerness into it? It needs to be a queer narrative in whatever that may mean for you.
I mean, specifically Frail, I'm not going to keep going on about Frail, but that is a story about a trans girl specifically who suffers a strange event which ages her to the point where she looks like an old man. And that is about the fears about my own transition sort of manifested, and also just my fears about like losing people. I'm not necessarily afraid to die, but like losing people has been on my mind a lot, and it's definitely coalesced a lot in just sort of, will I grow old and be unable to have the body I want and look a certain way? In general, I usually inject queer elements into my characters, and I usually like to write queer characters who are very muddled. They all have answers, like big answers to their queer identity and how the rest of the world should be for them. They haven't quite figured it out yet. They're making these big statements about love and hate and all that, but they haven't really given the thought of, what if I'm wrong? What if the way I'm experiencing my identity is not universal?
I suppose that reflects how a lot of us feel. We don't really have a big answer to our identities. It takes a lot of time to figure it out, and reflecting that in your writing, I think, is very important to show more like less clearly defined queer characters on screen. You know, they have their identity, but there's all these nuances, and they work through it in a way, because I think that's how most of us do relate to it. We're not like the clear cut characters of like, she's a lesbian, he's gay. It's very different.
Could you possibly be drawing?
Nothing. I'm not sure I can find anything in my own personal experience whatsoever.
I think a lot about writing queer characters. That's not visual. I did what is it called? The quotation.
Yeah.
Queer characters. I sometimes think about characters who are queer who genuinely have no indication of being like gay. Like they are queer. They have queer experiences in them, but it doesn't mean they're necessarily bi or gay or like ace, whatever. I mean, that's something I really want to get into more, because my relationship to people is something I think about a lot in my writing, because I might be ace. I don't know. I don't feel a lot of like sexual attraction to people. It's very occasional, and when it happens, it usually happens at the wrong time.
Is there ever a right time though?
Is there ever?
Is there ever a right time?
Ever a right time? I don't know. This is my queer tragedy.
My queer tragedy. That's a great topic.
My queer tragedy. Yeah. It's going to be my embarrassing biography, and that's something I put into my characters a lot. In Frail specifically, I have the character of Ada considering going out with her friend or asking her friend out on a date, and she has to sort of dwell with that quite a bit. Like, oh, am I genuinely feeling attraction for this person, or do I feel like I need to be attracted to someone, or am I not normal if I'm not with someone? Even though I've never felt this before, do I need to push this?
As I was saying earlier, I think the themes are, I like that muddledness, the idea of it's not clear. Again, I think a lot of us view our identities in that way, where it's not this clear-cut thing. You know, I was going to make a point about bisexuality and lesbianism. There is a lot of, it's not exactly a defining straight line.
This is your anti-bisexual.
No, I'm not anti-bisexual. But I feel like, to take the example of what I was saying, a lot of bisexuals do feel that way. But there's just this difference in their attraction to different genders, and it's not a clear-cut line. It's more of a sort of muddled spectrum, and I think going for those feelings can be quite difficult.
Oh, absolutely. I think what really is to blame is the problem is with a lot of queer people is that when we sort of all meet up and gather, it's wonderful, it's lovely. Mm-hmm. But I always get the feeling of doubt when I meet up with other trans people, sometimes like trans women specifically, like, am I acting the wrong way? Mm-hmm. Am I not presenting feminine enough? Am I not shaving enough to look feminine? And I sort of have to push it out because it just makes me feel miserable. I know who I am in my heart, and I'm not like 100% sure of like what I need to be or what specific labels are attached to me. Sometimes it's a problem. I do try and reject certain like expectations of what a trans woman is. That's both been liberating and problematic for me because I feel like I've become slightly too judgmental in certain cases.
I think a lot of people will have, especially a lot of trans women will have the same sort of feeling of you are put into a box by society, and then you go and meet up with other trans people and you're put into a box inadvertently by them. It's not as straightforward and clear, but there's this sort of...
And not as malicious.
Yeah, there is like a sort of inadvertent expectation of how you're supposed to dress, present, and so on. But I think what you touched on earlier with Frail, the idea of like growing old in a body that isn't yours, that's a worry for a lot of people, especially right now. We've seen a lot of things online from people who do transition later on in life. It's comforting to know that is a possibility for people. I mean, some people don't find out they're trans till like 40, and that's a whole thing.
I mean, my mum, who worked in a hospital down in Somerset, she knew someone who found out they were trans at age 60, and she transitioned, and that was fine.
Yeah, there was this was an ITV a while ago. There was an elderly trans woman on the ITV morning show. She was like 80 something, and they were being like, wow, you transitioned, it's so amazing. And she was like, yeah, you know, I don't even know I'm 80. I just felt the need to do it because of this. So there is that element of people still transition later on in life. Do you find that powerful though?
Writing from my specific perspective, absolutely. I find it very freeing. I think when you're younger, you worry, and I sort of worry looking back on it, like, do I have my own beliefs, and am I my own person? Because you get a lot of influences from people sort of bombarded at you, and sometimes you sort of take it on, you don't really think critically about it. But now as an adult, I know who I am, I know what I believe, and those beliefs will change, obviously, because that's life. I am free of outside influences, and I can project myself onto this work. Not free of outside influences, that's wrong, because everything influences us all the time. I know at the core of that I have my own perspective and I am my own person.
I think that's a very important thing for every creative to have, to know that the work you put out is really important. I've just come from a talk by Jocelyn Affleck.
Jocelyn Affleck?
And they were talking about their journey. This is in graphic design, so slightly different. But they were talking about how they've come to a point where they need to find this sort of like impetus to go forward, and realizing that perhaps the very professional curated stuff just isn't for them, and doing something that's more personal, really finding out what they in themselves believe is the better way forward, and to start performing creative practice from a more personal standpoint.
With me, I'm going into an industry job. It's my goal currently. But if I get my sort of writing job or an opportunity to write for a TV show, and I find out I don't like it and I don't want to pursue it, I will try and pursue other avenues. You aren't locked into it. And especially the British writing industry is poor. it's a very limited pool of voices who don't want to share. And it can be a bit disheartening. And I want to get into it. I want to write a TV show. But if that isn't the way, then I will find something else.
First of all, I admire that sense of resilience. But everyone kind of needs it in their especially young creatives. You kind of need it to be like queer or not queer, but especially talking about from creating from a personal standpoint. I think that's doubled even in when you are queer, because you feel that need to say, this is a fundamental part of my identity. I really want to portray it creatively, and almost not doing that inhibits you.
Yeah.
Because then there's a major part of you that wants to be expressed, and it just kind of can't be.
Yeah, and especially for like trans creative. Think about how much like trans representation is on TV currently. There's nothing. There's barely anything. There are shows and out there we have minor characters, and like a few of them like break them up, but it's poor. It's really, really poor. And I think placing that in your work is very important, even if it's not directly. Your creative influence there and your voice in that department is so valuable, because it is, one, going to be something interesting no matter what, and two, needed. Everything is very stagnant at the moment. These stories aren't coming through. We aren't getting any trans stories.
There were a couple. Previously we've talked about Nava Mao, and I need to editor's note for myself, the person in Barbie who played Dr. Barbie.
Mm-hmm.
Editing me here. The trans actress in Barbie is Harry Neff, just like last episode, not Nava Mao. I think I confused these two a lot because I was reading about them at the same time, and they both brought trans roles into very mainstream media. But yes, just like last episode, trans actress in Barbie is Harry Neff. One I saw very recently was a new film by Laverne Cox.
Oh, this is the new... It got nominated, didn't it? For awards?
So the one that was nominated was Karla, Sofia Gascon's Emilia Perez. There's some controversy around it, but it is like a trans-focused.
I know some people did not like that movie. I've not watched it, so I make no judgment on it, but I know some people hated that movie. That it disrespected both trans people. And where is it set?
It's set in Colombia. It's about a Colombian drug lord.
I'll give it a watch.
Editing me here. So Emilia Perez is about a Mexican drug lord who transitions initially to kind of save her own life and to avoid being arrested, and later on it actually becomes part of herself, and she starts to realize that she is fully trans, although I think that has been changed in subsequent editions in terms of whether it's first a ploy to escape capture or she was trans all along and she did it for the convenience of it. Anyway, that's the whole thing about the film. Karla Sofia Gascon plays the titular character. She is also the first out transgender woman to be nominated for an Oscar. The issue is she's published some tweets in the past which are seen as racist and offensive, as well as the film being very culturally insensitive towards Mexican culture. It's Mexican culture, not Colombian. I did say Colombian in the interview. So it's this bizarre intersection of an out trans actress in something very culturally insensitive, and I'm not too sure what to make of it with all the backlash and the strange reactions to it. So I've put all the articles that I read in the show notes. People can make up their own minds about it.
Honestly, I will pursue trans stories to watch because I just want to see how they do it.
Genuinely find them really interesting.
Yeah.
Just anything. Some of them are a bit horrendous.
I'm not going to watch the one with Eddie Redmayne in it, obviously.
The one I was thinking of is actually Laverne Cox's Clean Slate.
Oh yeah, I've never heard of this.
It's a new film. It's coming out recently. It's about her. She's transitioned. She moves back to Alabama and kind of confronts her dad, and her dad has to work out her transition, and she's back in her hometown, and it's this sort of merging of that. So Clean Slate is about a trans woman, played by Laverne Cox, who has to come back home from New York City to her home in Alabama and meet her estranged father she hasn't seen since transitioning. And it's a rather heartwarming comedy about the family dynamic, especially with a trans character, which I haven't seen before. And it's rather nice to see that on screen and to have this sort of, obviously there's the undertone of the difficulties sometimes interacting with family life in a more conservative small state, but there's this uptone beat. It's just rather like a small like family sitcom with just a trans character in it, where their transness isn't this big thing. I mean, it is a part of the story. It doesn't actually suffocate itself in the importance of that. So yes, I thought it was quite heartwarming and quite a good comedy. Are there any writers or directors that you think instill queerness into their work?
I took a long time to think about this one because I was really struggling. Who are the sort of queer writers and directors I sort of follow like the most, like avidly? I think what I've come to is, funnily, Don Mancini, the creator of the Chucky franchise.
Yes. Because Chucky's actually queer in this. Well, he has a queer kid.
Yeah, play the clip. Play it. That's our sponsor. Don Mancini is gay. He is a gay man, and talked about before in writing specifically Seed of Chucky, which I watched recently. It's got a very unpleasant opening. You might want to skip the very opening credit. He specifically talked about how him coming to terms with sexuality, he really found a lot of solidarity in trans people, and sort of especially like people who are sort of gender fluid, and that's characterized in Chucky's child, who is gender fluid, at least partially in Seed of Chucky, and then later like canonized in the TV show. And it got me thinking just about horror in general. This has been said before by many different people. Horror is a real good space for queer people. It is the stories about monsters preying on the most vulnerable people in society. It's minorities in a whole. Like, there is a lot to like find in the narratives of like horror films, because while often there will be horror films where, oh, the monster kills all of you, there will be narratives about people who are like very marginalized rising up against these sort of seemingly impossible beings and sort of like defeating them. And Chucky's a really interesting one because it talks a lot about the body, what body you feel comfortable in. Like the main villain, Chucky, is often trying to like possess people and take over their bodies. And then later on in the series, his like character development is like, no, I've accepted the state I'm in. This is my new body and I like it. I feel powerful in this way. And he's a scumbag. But it's so interesting to explore through the villains of a series the need to have like your own body and like a preferred form. And I just find it really fascinating.
That is something you just said about the idea of confronting marginalization head on. Two films spring to mind: Get Out.
Oh yeah.
That's it. The whole film is about racism and how it is a very insidious form. And I was going to ask you this. I Saw the TV Glow.
Yes. I Saw the TV Glow was a very, very good movie that a lot of people connected with. I didn't connect with it that much. I thought it was a fantastic film. I was more surprised that Fred Durst of Limp Bizkit is in that movie. That film is gorgeous. It's so well paced. It feels fantastic. The acting's amazing, but there's nothing really connects with me like that on an emotional level. Honestly, the films I've connected with on a queer level have usually not been explicitly queer. They usually have like a character in there who feels queer, who I usually sort of like reach out with and connect with, like Deep Space Nine. That's got a lot of queer characters in it who are not defined by that. And I've always sort of reached out to them a lot more.
Absolutely. I think that hidden queerness is always really interesting to explore. It's a very strange way I came across it was I was watching a film with my mum. It's a classic Steve Martin comedy called Roxanne.
Ah, yeah.
One of the characters in it dresses very queer. I mean, it's a very lesbian dress. And I said to my mum, that is like the lesbian dress. Like, she's a lesbian. My mum couldn't exactly get it. It's so interesting to see a character dressed up now very stereotypically in a lesbian way in a 1980s Steve Martin film, and you're like, wow, what's this character doing on screen?
Yeah, and like visual indicators are still like really interesting because like you're like, oh wow, that's a queer character. I'm immediately connected. And I think the most impactful thing about I Saw the TV Glow is less its like explicitly queer element. Some people have said it's not explicit. I think it's pretty explicit with what it's trying to do. What really did connect with me is its hopeful message. People, I think, were watching and thought this is overtly quite sad and quite like melancholy, but it's a very hopeful movie. We were talking about that you can find out you're trans at any point in your life and you can embrace your transness whenever. It doesn't go away. It's always a part of you. I think my favorite parts of that film is when that's being put through the lens of like an old 90s TV show and the disappointment you have of watching it and it's not as good as you thought it was, and you sort of reflecting on your past and childhood about being trans and like not being fully who you are, and just it's not as good as you remember because you weren't fully you. I definitely reflect on that a lot with my teenage years because I was miserable. I was really depressed and I couldn't get it. I couldn't get why.
I think a lot of late bloomers, in quotation marks, would experience the same thing of, oh, my teenage years weren't fully what they were and I missed out on these like traditional formative experiences that I didn't experience the way I wanted to. And that's something quite powerful about that. And always in your mind, romanticizing that.
Yeah, and that's what I'm doing with Frail, basically.
It's a really fascinating concept. It's a bit, as I said, a bit terrifying, but I feel it's good to confront that and to produce a piece of media that does terrify us a little bit. I guess we want to ask, is there any undercurrents of positivity in it? Is there any little glimmer of hope?
In Frail, yeah. Within Frail, yeah, absolutely. And not so much in the first episode, which I'm writing. Frail is about the trans experience, but it's also about being a teenager and being mentally ill, because I was mentally ill and I can understand that a bit more and handle it a lot better. When the character goes through this terrible thing and tries to escape, people find her unrecognizable in her like old state, quite miserable. It's very depressing. It's dragging you down. But right in the final moments of the show, she makes a realization. She is in this sort of mysterious house that her kidnapper keeps trying to tell her to connect with. He's trying to discover something about himself. He's also quite lost, but he's older. He feels like he's running out of time. And she finally makes that connection, and that gives her the sort of spark to keep living.
There is certainly an element of that when I think in general, we sit down and we view a lot of things of like, oh, there's because 2025 is such a bizarre year, I feel.
It doesn't really feel like it started yet, like fully.
I feel like it has slightly. I think the thing I was going to say in terms of that through lots of times of trouble, you often feel like what it really is the point. But there always is this future thing of there is a point in living. Not in like a melodramatic, there's a point in living, but there is an actual point in living because there is this tangible thing that we can hold on to and say, oh, you know, in a couple of weeks' time, I have this big event coming up. This would be really good to do.
Editing me here. I think what I was trying to say in this is that oftentimes we struggle to feel uplifted. And I think there are two things around this. And one of those things I didn't actually mention in the interview, and that is doom scrolling. I think it's important to read the news, be aware, but also curate what we take in. I think it's good to have a selected feed, read what's going on, talk to people in the community, rather than just doom scroll and sit there. It can be very overwhelming with just endless feed. And I think that can immobilize us to the other things that are going on and to any action. I also think it's important to have moments of joy, especially queer and trans joy. And I think hopefully through the creative endeavors that we do, that can bring that to us. When we see something was made by a queer person, or that we make something as a queer person, we go, oh, that was a moment of joy. I contributed to the world. So I think that was what I was trying to say in the interview. But anyway, back to the main interview.
Recording this in the end of January. January weather is horrendous. It's horrible.
It's been pretty nice today, though. It's been sunny.
It has actually, as I say this, it's sunny today. It's nice.
Just that little glimmer of sort of waiting for something, like things will get better. The most I want to get out of Frail as a script and hopefully produce it into something, because I do have a lot of faith in my idea, is that I want to sort of be a comfort to queer audiences, and I want to confront everyone else, because I feel like most TV shows aren't as confronting as they need to be. They need to be punchy. They need like real drama is what I want to sort of achieve with that.
And I really hope that you do get to produce that and that does get written. And when it does, I'll be there to view it.
No, I'm not going to let you in.
Thank you very much for being on the archive today.
Thank you very much. I had a very good time.
Me too.
This is a clean podcast.
As you keep saying.
Yeah, it's very clean.
So, where can people find you? Any socials, anyway you'd like to promote?
Oh, God. Do I have anywhere to promote? I have an Instagram. I'm called Ollie on there. I've got a picture of a lurcher as my profile picture that you can try and get me on there, because if you're a writer and you want to get in touch, call me, because I'm very lonely. Instagram mostly is where I am.
So, yes, thank you very much for being on today. Can't wait to see Frail when it comes out.
Thank you very much.
And as always, get this podcast wherever you find your podcasts. Personally, I like to use Pocket Casts. That's not a sponsored thing or anything. I just personally like them. But wherever you like to get your podcasts, the Lilac Archive will be there. Thank you to Ollie for being on the archive, and thank you for listening. I hope this was both an entertaining and informative instalment on the wide variety of culture and queer life. If you have any suggestions for individuals or organisations, or if you yourself want to be on the podcast, write into lilacarchivepodcast@gmail.com. My apologies for the change in email address, but such things happen as we set up. But our new email, just to reiterate, is lilacarchivepodcast@gmail.com. We will be back in the next episode with the newest instalment in the archive.
I know this is an editing note right at the end of the episode, but our email is lilacarchivepod@gmail.com. Switching between two email addresses can be quite a lot, so I'm sorry I missed that. But anyway, we'll be back the next episode, the next installment in the archive.